Thank you. First off, thanks, Karis and Nick, for putting this together, and thanks for inviting me. Great keynote, Amber. Thank you very much. Before I kick things off, I just wanted to share with you guys. It's turned off. I just wanted to share with you guys a little realization I had the other day. This is kind of uncharted territory for me. I don't think at any point in my life, up until this moment, I have ever been allowed, let alone asked, to speak for 30 minutes uninterrupted. So bear with me, I'm kind of testing out some new ideas in this talk. But what I'm here to impress upon you today is that cities eat cyborgs. Now, what I mean by that is that technology doesn't change cities. Cities, in fact, change technology. In the words of Adam Greenfield, societies, as it happens, turn their backs on technologies all the time, even some that seem to be on the very cusp of their ascension to prominence. Citizens' initiatives have significantly shaped technology's emergence and their commercial viability, and this has been the case even with groups of disconnected individuals when they've faced coherent, swaggeringly self-confident, and infinitely better funded pro-technology lobbies. Now, whether that change that I'm talking about happens over 1, 10, or 100 years or even more, in the end, in spite of all the good that it may have brought along with it, technology often proves to have been just a mere distraction, keeping us from understanding and addressing cities' real problems. In fact, the grand narrative of the 21st century of urbanism is shaping up to be, don't do what we did in the 20th century, the century of failed technological determinism. But in spite of all these failings of cities, people continue to flock to them. So why? Well, cities are arguably the killer app of humanity, the original social network, one of the earliest successes of crowdsourcing. Urban life provides a vitality, complexity, and intimacy that unleashes our collective potential like nothing else. But it wasn't always like that. For a long time, human civilization was resigned to the rural, commuting to the city. Well, you can't see any of that, but that's these really wonderful paintings by Ambrogio Lorenzetti that you can find in Siena. For a long time, human civilization was resigned to the rural, and they only just went into the city every once in a while to engage in commerce. Those cities were a major fixture in the history of empires, often outlasting the empires themselves. Their population represented an incredibly small minority. But then, something happened. By the beginning of the 20th century, globally, roughly 13% of the world had moved to cities. And in just 110 years since, that figure has ballooned to over 50%. By the end of the century, if we extrapolate that out, it's going to be closer to 80, which in fact is the ratio we're sitting at in BC today. In such chaotic and lively environments, with everyone's heart set on progress, technology has an opportunity to be a great agent of change. Dreams of technology have been at the heart of the modern city have dominated the narrative of our urban century. Whether it was Austin's moonlight towers, Brasilia's highways and Temple to the Car, Vancouver's SkyTrain, Rio de Janeiro's Central Control Center, or Kansas City and Google Fiber, like a landmark building, technology has been a billboard of progress. But those dreams continue. Personal rapid transit, self-driving cars, flying cars, augmented reality, alternative energy, drone-based delivery services, the Internet of Things, and the smart city. These all promise some sort of a technological utopia. But reality is quite a bit messier than that. In very profound ways, we are constantly overestimating the power of technologies to shape our action in our cities. In spite of being a fertile ground for technological ingenuity, there are significant forces shaping the urban fabric that technology alone cannot overcome. Forces emanating from deeply rooted economic, political, environmental, social, and cultural concerns. Forces rooted in the struggle for consensus. Technology must adapt to these forces in order to survive. The lines of pressure are converging from many directions. Limits of environmentally rich land and clean water are being felt throughout the country. Shifts in family size and workforce are changing our social structure. Issues of environmental and personal health are mounting. Costs of capital and time are reordering investments, and not the least, a new search for identity, community, and a sense of place is motivating many people's lives. But too often, we see this challenge only in technical terms. The allure of technological solutions to urban problems is incredibly strong. Novel and exciting, the successful stitching of an urban technology into the fabric of our society has often been viewed as a triumph of man's will. But while these solutions are seductive and promise unparalleled efficiency, they aren't always the most practical, economical, or acceptable. I think our main failing in the last 100 years was that we viewed the problems of the city too narrowly and through the wrong lens. So what might those other lenses be? Well, in my mind, I think that there's about 4 lenses that we can view the problems of a city through. The first is logistics. That'd be the study of how resources move and collect around the city. We see this in the programming of infrastructure, public transportation, utility governance, traffic management, zoning, and so on. The second one would be one of ownership. And I mean this in 2 ways. In one way, I mean it literally, that residents and businesses can feel legitimized through truly investing in a place, owning an actual piece of it, but I also mean this in the sense of mutual responsibility. Third, there's the lens of community. What is the strength of the social fabric? How neighborly are people? How healthy is the street life? And what kind of an open dialogue is happening between people of varied backgrounds? Last but not least is consensus. How do we get all of those various actors in the city to arrive at some kind of a common ground? Now the individual, the urban denizen, sits at the middle of all of these. They view most of the problems through the near lenses of ownership and community. And they are most likely to find agency or a lack thereof in the city as they experience life through these lenses, as they seek a sense of belonging. In the wise words of Andy Yan from Bing Tom Architects, when people feel like they belong, they create very strong communities because they feel like this is home. Furthest from the day-to-day experiences of the individual are those lenses of logistics and consensus. An individual may experience frustration in those domains, yes, but those lenses require a sense of scale that appeals to the sensibilities and concerns of a much larger organization. And over the last 100 years, with all of its top-down master plan emphasis on the city as machine, our laser focus has been set on solving problems through the lens of logistics. And when you view problems through the lens of logistics, technology is a wonderful antidote, but logistics are actually rarely the most common concern of the urban citizen. Those citizens have their own personal concerns, especially when it comes to things like technology. Is it safe? Is it affordable? Is it comfortable? How does it look? Won't it bring crime to the area? Will it affect my property values? What am I going to get out of it? And the cities, they have organizational concerns. How much money will it cost? Is it compatible with the current infrastructure? Is it accessible to everybody? Who is going to oversee this? Whose budget will it come out of? And if we do it, will they vote for us again? Then beyond that, still, there are the business stakeholders, developers, lobbyists, higher forms of government. Achieving consensus on all of these matters is an absolute clusterfuck. But to illustrate this, let's take a moment and let's reflect back a couple 100 years on the story of a very popular modern day tool that was once itself a cutting edge technology. The bicycle. Our story starts in Germany in 1817. A man named Drees, becoming concerned with the number of horses dropping dead of starvation due to climate-driven crop failure, invents the Dreesienne, the first prototype of the bike. Sure, it has no pedals and no brakes, but it was reportedly able to reach speeds of up to 13 kilometers an hour, comparable to the trotting speed of a horse. Logistically, very appropriate. Several thousand copies of this new piece of technology were sold, and as might be expected, it was terribly unsafe, not to mention that people kept on wearing out the heels of their boots. So after a string of accidents, it was prohibited from a number of cities. It had failed to achieve consensus. 2 years later, an improved version called the hobby horse failed once again for essentially the same reasons. And the idea of two-wheeled public transportation disappeared until around 1863 when the Velocipede, better known as the Bone Shaker, was released. The Velocipede had 3 amazing new features: pedals, brakes, and most importantly, the ability to steer. But these things were still fairly clumsy, uncomfortable, strange looking, and ostensibly pretty heavy. And you got to remember that around this time the roads were still fairly poor, made of dirt and cobblestone. So aside from riders being very uncomfortable, that pedestrian element once again drove these things out of the city. And it wasn't without some impassioned and poetic protest, such as this one from Yale College student Carl Cron. So I'm going to read this for you. They fancy riders, cannot steer, and cannot safely move with speed, and so they feign a foolish fear whene'er comes up Velocipede. Don't believe the stories that they tell of accident or foul misdeed. The journal's horse has long since got well, uninjured by Velocipede. 'Tis envy simply that's at work. The one who must on foot proceed feels jealous when with artful quirk another rides Velocipede. Some too there are who hate all fun, who count all sport of ill the seed, and such judge that the evil one himself devised Velocipede. Thanks. Anyways, long story short, Carl lost, and the bike disappeared for another 15-odd years, finally resurfacing in 1885. By this point, the relative perfection of the pneumatic tire, the addition of smaller gear ratios, and a chain transmission had allowed for the introduction of the safety bicycle. It was an instant hit, and it sparked the very first major bike craze. This drove competition for better engineering and lower prices, which in turn made ownership more accessible to an even broader audience. Communities then began to grow around these bicycles, sparking advocacy groups such as LAW, the League of American Wheelmen. The popularity was so high by this point that the quality of roads for bicycle travel became an increasingly important logistical problem. Consensus had even grown so strong around bikes as a viable mode of transport that LAW was able to spearhead the Good Roads movement in North America in 1896, leading to the very first paved roads in North America. Law had become so incredibly politically influential by this point that they were even given an office in the Republican Party HQ during William McKinley's successful 1896 run for presidency. If you can see, that's William McKinley's bust on a button for the National Wheelman. But that was short-lived because not too long after the automobile showed up. And in France and much of the rest of Europe, while they continued to share roads, here and in the UK, it was kind of one or the other. The bike as a mode of transportation died out with its pioneers and was relegated to being a children's toy. It would have to, in fact, wait for the next century and a man named Jan Gell, but for now, the automobile had won. But even as it increased the speed of cities and the width of their streets and later afforded suburban sprawl, yet another technology was stretching our cities skybound and flipping socioeconomic status on its head: the elevator. Arriving in its present form in 1903, it was an excellent solution for solving the logistical problem of getting to the 10th floor and beyond in residential tower. But if the elevator didn't just allow buildings to stretch much higher, before the elevator, you had paid extra to live on the ground floor. Suddenly now, you were paying extra for a view. On the cutting edge of technology, we are continually promised a new dominion over reality that would match a skilled painter's dominion over his blank canvas. A new model urbanism gets crafted in the minds of experts and brushed onto reality stroke by stroke as a new city, a master plan, a perfect work of art. You can find examples of these greenfield developments scattered throughout the history of cities, even of course predating urban planning as a profession. Let's take a look at a few. So here you see St. Petersburg, or sort of see it, in its modern form. But let me tell you a little bit about the origins behind it. As a young man, the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great, had sought to learn more about the world beyond Russia's borders. He wanted a modern Russia. And so he left the country in disguise to conduct research and apprenticed as a shipbuilder in Amsterdam. He fell in love with it. A truly international city of commerce, arguably the pinnacle of urban living in its age, it showcased Dutch engineering via its magnificent canals. Peter decided he wanted his own city of canals, his own city of international commerce. So he threw the lives of 100,000 forced laborers into the foundations of St. Petersburg. With amazing speed, they drew it forth from a barren Arctic swamp. In just 9 years after the first stone was laid in 1703, Peter the Great and his court of proto-cyborgs moved there from Moscow. It was a city that only the infinite wealth of an empire could buy, a dream city. It's been written, while the philosophy of architecture moves from the particular to the universal, St. Petersburg moved from the universal to the particular. It was built in the heavens and dropped whole to earth. An aesthetic success, it was comparable to living in a drawing. Now, Peter had been so obsessed with this technology of sailing that the Dutch had mastered, which allowed them to take total control of ocean trade, so obsessed that he didn't initially allow bridges to be built in St. Petersburg at all. Instead, its blocks would be islands, and its residents would learn to sail or just be stranded. Even oars were not allowed. But for obvious reasons, this did not succeed. So even though to a czar like Peter the Great, consensus was really a non-issue, logistical failings were huge, and Peter eventually acquiesced, allowing bridges to be built. Unfortunately, he continued to micromanage everything else, and though he died optimistic and triumphant, the city took on a life of its own, ultimately destabilizing Russia and leading to the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, that might be oversimplifying things, but in Peter's travels and apprenticeships as a builder, he had made a fatal mistake. He had begun to view man and the city as mechanical entities. Change the inputs, change the outputs. The only problem is that man is not a machine. The inputs and outputs of humanity cannot be controlled with mechanical precision. And this way of thinking eerily foreshadowed what became the dominant mode of 20th century heroic modern urbanists like Le Corbusier: man and city as machine. Perhaps the most famous whipping boy of failed modernist urbanism can be found in Brasilia, brushed onto reality or dropped from the heavens by urban planner Lucio Costa. Designed from the same God's eye view, it was a sculptural success wrought from nothing within a mere 41 months. Though it's still a city today, bustling in its own way, and its population has continued to grow, it is essentially viewed as the anti-pattern of a city for humans. Designed to look from like an eagle from the sky, it feels like a desert at human scale. In the words of Jan Gehl, the only way you can be happy here is if you own a helicopter. Brasilia could never be the city of the future because our society remains that of the past. Those are the words of Oscar Niemeyer, one of the architects on Costa's team. So you can see, even when the city failed to live up to its dream, the modernists just basically chalked it up to human error. In spite of the dead bodies of top-down urbanism that lay before us, though, we continue to press on. New cities continue to be developed from a master plan mentality. Great example right here is Songdo. If you can see it, it's just an angry-looking computer chip. An international business city, it's set to open its doors, I think, wide in 2015. It's really a paragon of smart technology, but probably a better way to think of it is an urban showroom for Cisco. Then there's Masdar in the United Arab Emirates. Once again, just kind of looks like a computer chip. This is Norman Foster's newest project, and the goal here is to build a self-sustaining city in the middle of the Arab desert. Now, as laboratories for testing the vanguard of urban engineering progress and the Internet of Things, these are bound to be phenomenal successes and produce heaps of valuable results. There's a lot to love about them. But if they do, or probably when they do, succeed as cities, it will not be because of that technology. They will succeed because of the ingenuity and adaptation of their citizens. So I'd like to read you a quote from Jane Jacobs, the people's champion of urban planning. She's got a great insight onto why these master plans fail. When we deal with cities, we are dealing with life at its most complex and intense. Because this is so, there is a basic aesthetic limitation on what can be done with cities. A city cannot be a work of art. Under certain circumstances, the creation of art can apparently be done by general and, in effect, anonymous consensus. For instance, in a closed society, a technologically hampered society, or an arrested society, either hard necessity or tradition and custom can enforce upon everyone a disciplined selectivity of purposes and materials, a discipline by consensus on what those materials demand of their organizers, and a disciplined control over the forms thereby created. For us, such societies might be interesting to ponder, and we may regard their harmonious works with admiration or a kind of nostalgia, wondering wistfully, why can't we be like that? Well, we can't be like that because the limitations on possibilities and the strictures on individuals in such societies extend much beyond the materials and conceptions used in creating works of art from the grist of everyday life. For all our conformity, we are too adventurous, inquisitive, egoistic, and competitive to be a harmonious society of artists by consensus. And what is more, we place a very high value on those very traits that prevent us from being so. The important points here are master plans don't matter. Technological determinism is a moot point. Cities are too messy, people are too different. We need to forget about the view from the heavens and return to the human scale. Today, with Jane Jacobs sadly departed, we have a new people's champion in urban planning, Jan Gehl. Now, Jan Gehl warns in all of his work of departure from the human scale in the world of bricks. He warns that if we forget to carefully consider the experience of a city at the street level, we will erode its capacity to deliver on the promise of vitality, complexity, and intimacy. However, the Songdos and Mazdars of the world now have a dimension of sprawl beyond the physical, vertical, and horizontal. They sprawl into cyberspace, or perhaps a better word is sublimate. And it isn't just the master plan cities that are undergoing sublimation. All cities are looking for ways to leverage cyberspace to solve their problems. But getting into cyberspace poses problems in and of itself. Last year, as a representative of the PhoneGap team when I was still at Adobe with my partner in crime, Michael Brooks, we gave a presentation at the Municipal Information Services Association of BC conference to advise on just those problems. It's a pretty grim situation for cities when it comes to facing these new technologies. So grim that we decided to name our talk Dawn of Devices, and the whole thing had like a zombie theme. You can't see, but there's a horde of zombies in the background there. When cities think about a digital strategy, they face unimaginably difficult decisions because they're obligated to service everybody and they have fairly tight budgets. In the words of the city of Vancouver, the challenge for Vancouver and perhaps all cities is to be more agile under the diametrically opposed pressure of consumer-driven technology adoption and expectations, and the increasing need to minimize risk and maximize value. Our recommendation to the IT departments in these cities was to unlock their open data in the form of APIs, become information developers. Why? Because cities are full to the tits of aspiring app developers, and you would be surprised at how many people, once you release it, once you unleash that information, will start solving your problems and their own problems on their own accord. And a nice upside to that is you'll be ready for any new tech. Now, I've read through the City of Vancouver's digital strategy a number of times, and I have to say it looks pretty decent on paper. We may be behind some cities, but we're still ahead of many. And if we subject it to urban theorist Anthony Townsend's 5 foundations for inclusion in a digital city, it scores a pretty decent 3.5 out of 5. There's a provision for free or low-cost broadband connectivity. I don't think we can really control access to personal network interfaces on a city level, but the market seems to be doing a good job of driving those prices down. There isn't really, from what I could see, a provision for fully public interfaces. It'd be like control panels that everyone can access, in spite of their economic standing. But there is also robust cloud compute, well, robust, I don't know, but they're going to open up their APIs. And they do have a very, very sincere commitment to open data policies, which is great. But the city is only viewing, and can really only view these problems through the lenses of logistics and consensus. Ownership and community, I would argue, are kind of up to us. Cities building some infrastructure, but it's up to us to follow the lead of bicycle pioneers and start using technology to reshape our cities of our own accord. So how do we do that? Well, if I reflect upon the city of Vancouver in the 31 years that I've lived here, from a very personal point of view, I have a hard time pinpointing a single technology that's improved my experience. I've definitely achieved narrow efficiency gains, but my experience of Vancouver isn't really much more pleasurable now than it was during Expo 86. Ever since the emergence of cyberspace, there's all these predictions that the public space was redundant and cyberspace would take over. We have no evidence whatsoever that that's taking place. For all the smartphones and social media gurus in Vancouver, not a week goes by where I don't hear someone complain that it's a difficult city to live in. In spite of the cost of living, though, they aren't usually complaining about finances. They're complaining about isolation and loneliness. 1 out of 3 of them are complaining about that if you believe the Vancouver Foundation study that was released last year. So if the core promise of cities is one of vitality, complexity, and intimacy, Vancouver gets very low marks. And if you view our cities through the lenses of ownership and community, it gets lower marks still. But I think there's a way out. For all my bemoaning of cyborgs and technology, I'd like to close with 3 small, modest, and relatively imperfect ideas about improving Vancouver life by reshaping technology to consider the human scale. But I've got a caveat that these are technologies that require your participation. They're definitely half-baked ideas. So if anyone wants to follow through with them with me, chat me up after. Now, I've been a Vancouver musician for about a decade and a half now, and it's a frustrating experience. A lot of shows in the city happen in illegal or semi-legal venues that pop up and then get quickly shut down. The reason? Part of it is archaic liquor laws and poor zoning requirements that make it nearly impossible to run a legitimate space. Now, these things are getting better, and I got to thank the city for taking some action on it, but you know, the reality is that's going to be a very slow process. So I was thinking, in the meantime, what if there was a way to help these venues be good neighbors so that they wouldn't have such short lifespans? With that thought on my mind when participating in last year's Global Service Jam, me and some others came up with the idea of an extensible hobo language. So for those unfamiliar, the hobo code was a series of symbols that was used during the Great Depression. Wanderers would mark the outside of homes with that so that other wanderers, when they came past, would kind of know how to behave to get good results. It was a shared code to promote a certain conduct. So in a similar fashion, the extensible hobo language could be used to encode a certain code of conduct for Vancouver's underground venues. All of this being in the hope that when I show up at a new venue, I know exactly what I should be doing to promote the health of that space and keep it running. But it doesn't just stop at underground venues. It's really something that anyone else could use, right? Different communities and interest groups could, of course, modify the schema of this extensible hobo language. Maybe freegans could even use it to mark dumpsters, for example. So it's really a quick and dirty way to give underground communities a dialect for code of conduct and maybe start to pique the less technically inclined or technically adamant individual into the opportunities that exist within an open data. Another problem that we face in Vancouver is one of rapid development. Well, it's not really a problem, it's just a difficult reality. Because development isn't bad outright, but for a lot of people, change means uncertainty, which stokes quite a few fears. Now, without the proper tools to properly express themselves, citizens who are rightly skeptical of developers and municipalities' motives are often left sounding like frustrating NIMBYs. People talk at cross purposes in these debates all the time, for example, by imagining all density as towers instead of considering more compact forms. Important changes are often blocked as citizens are given a take it or leave it false dichotomy. It's either towers or sprawl, and there's no debate about streetscape. On both sides, visualizations are a crucial tool in the debate. Developers present beautiful images of mothers and babies and happy condo owners, whereas on the other hand, activists present overbearing, shadowing, hulky forms. What's missing is an objective tool in between. So this is a very rough prototype made by Neil Salmond, who will hopefully be joining us for drinks later. He just flew back from the UK yesterday. But it's got a repo up on GitHub, and the whole idea here is to let people quickly prototype their own without needing any technical aptitude and, you know, adhering to certain, you know, codes on fenestration and the rest to provide their own view of what they think the city could be like. But last but not least, I'd like to wrap up by closing the loop on elevators. As I mentioned earlier, they were a great solution to the logistical problem of vertical travel in buildings. But somewhere along the line, they became considered vessels of crime. Whether or not the problem of security in residential towers was then universally significant, or whether it is now universally significant, doesn't really matter, because we universally solve it through the lens of logistics. Got a really dry mouth. Right here you see a key fob. And this key fob is the solution to elevators. It only allows me to access my floor. Now, an unfortunate side effect of that is that if I live in a tower, I do not have access to the majority of the people that live in that tower with me. When viewing the elevator security problem through the lens of logistics alone, key fobs work fantastically. But it is my personal goal to really explore how that problem could be viewed through the other three lenses. The lenses of ownership, community, and consensus. And those are the lenses that I and the team that I work with try to apply to problems at Bazinga every day. The goal for us is that if we're successful, if we can help our vertical communities reclaim that vitality, complexity, and intimacies that we so strongly seek to preserve at the street level, maybe one day our cities will eat those key fobs alive. Thank you. I would just like to say one thing too. I'd like to thank my friend Joel Rich for making this amazing piece of art for my title slide. It deserves closer inspection. So I'll try and share it out.